Thank you very much for your waiting. Now we would like to introduce the people to be appeared on the stage for the session 1, the new U.S. administration and international order. This session will be moderated by Professor Takako Hikotani, and speakers are Dr. Randall Shriver, Dr. Leung Hee, Dr. Patrick Cronin, and our President, Ambassador Kenichiro Sasae. If you want to know further information on the speakers and the moderator, please look into the pamphlet at your hand. And this session is sponsored by Japan Foundation. Thank you very much. Now, Professor Hikotani, please, floor is yours. Thank you.
Global Dialogue. My name is Takako Hikotani. It is my great pleasure to moderate this first session of the dialogue this year. As Ambassador Sasae mentioned, this year's topic is the quest for global resilience. And I believe that this session is going to kick off with what's on everybody's mind about a possible challenge to global resilience, which is the new Trump administration. We have an excellent panel of panelists this afternoon, and I'm sure that we'll get to very deep discussion on this topic. I've been advised to mention that this session is supported by the generous support of Japan Foundation's Japan-US Global Partnership Program. And I would like to also mention that there will be time for Q&A. This session starts right now and will be ending at we will leave about 20 minutes for Q&A. The session will end around 2:45. So please start thinking about the questions. And this is also for the online audience as well. I would like to briefly introduce the panelists today. To my immediate left is Mr. Randy Shriver. He is the partner at the Pacific Solution and concurrently serves as chairman of the board of the Project 2049 Institute. Next is Mr. Leung Hee, Senior Fellow at the Tokyo Foundation for Policy Research. Patrick Cronin, Asia Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute and Scholar in Residence at Carnegie Mellon University. And Ambassador Sasae, the President of the Japan Institute for International Affairs and former Ambassador of Japan to the United States. So first, I'd like to open the session by asking what I think is the fundamental question that people have on the topic, is that what kind of continuity and change do you see from the previous administrations to the Trump 2.0? Mr. Shriver, you worked at the previous Trump administration. And so based on experience, what kind of continuity do you see possibly over the Trump 1.0, Trump 2.0, or do you see more change? And what if you see the Obama, Trump 1.0, Biden, Trump 2.0, is there an evolution of policy that you see more of a trend, or is it more of a zigzag of policy? And if you can refer to both the policy side of it and from your experience working in administration, the process side of it, that we've seen a lot of change already in the past week, that would be great. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, JIIA, for having me and for hosting this important dialogue. You start with a very easy question, simple to answer, right? But you did include in your question this notion of continuity going back to the Obama administration. And it's interesting, I used to say Trump 1.0 was more evolutionary than revolutionary in a lot of ways. Certainly a change in the style and rhetoric and the strategic documents. Had a finer point on it when it came to things like competition with China. But in fact, if you go back to the Obama administration, and particularly the second part, the pivot to Asia, which they swore up and down wasn't about China, which of course meant it was about China. But you had in that policy, you had commitment of 60% of our naval forces in the Indo-Pacific. You had the rebalance within the rebalance, concentration on Southeast Asian partners and allies and emerging relationships. And you had a lot of the foundation for what ultimately became the declared strategic competition in the Trump administration. So I do think there is an arc, particularly as it relates to China, that we'll see continued continuity. We saw it through the Biden administration, and in fact, in many ways, the Trump policies, there was doubling down, particularly on export controls and key sectors like semiconductors. So I think there is an arc there that will be characterized by continuity. I do think we have to caveat a little bit here. It's early. There's probably more we don't know than we know. But I think if we look at the first Trump term, we look at the personnel that are already in place, if we look at the campaign statements and the early glimpses of policy, we can start to sort of identify what some of the direction will be. So I think the first term, there was this real posturing for long-term competition with China. And that had, many elements to it. A prominent element was strengthening of our Defense Department and our military. That was primarily seen through the lens of increased defense budgets. Hold that thought, because I'm not sure that'll be the case in this 2.0 version. But it also was characterized by a lot of pressure on friends and allies to, quote, do more for themselves as part of not only relieving some of the burden on us, promote burden sharing, but in fact to a vision to strengthen deterrence vis-a-vis China and to uphold the free and open order. So I do think that'll be a quality and a characteristic of Trump 2.0. If you look at what Secretary Hegseth put out in his guidance, it was a lot of DEI and a lot of personnel and force structure issues and training issues. But there was that China piece there that was going to be one of the organizing principles. So I think we can confidently say that's going to be a point of continuity. When you look at the people, it's interesting because we have a National Security Council, a State Department led by, I would say, more traditional conservatives and pretty hawkish people. Mike Waltz, Marco Rubio, if you extend to lower levels that have been named, people like Alex Wong, Ivan Kanapathy, Mike Needham as counselor. This is a pretty hawkish group when it comes to China, and a very traditional group when it comes to placing high value on alliances and partnerships, and think very traditionally about the need to cooperate with allies and partners on any endeavor, but particularly when it comes to major efforts like deterrence related to China. I would say the Pentagon is a little more of a question mark. We have a Secretary of Defense who seems as though he was appointed primarily to deal with culture issues within the Pentagon and to, in his words, restore the warrior ethos. A Secretary of Defense who presumably is willing to do things like deploy troops to the southern border. So those really seem to be the priorities. And although the China challenge was stated in Secretary of Defense guidance, I think there's some questions about what that'll look like. There's attempts to kind of redefine what it means to be a China hawk. If you listen to some of the appointees within DOD, you can't be a real China hawk if you support Ukraine, because it shows you're not serious about bolstering your presence and posture in the Indo-Pacific and really dealing with China head on. So I think there's some debates there that'll play out. But it's a pretty interesting mix of folks, and I think, again, some strong presence of traditional conservatives who are hawkish on China, value alliances. Look at Marco Rubio day one and hosting of the AUKUS meeting. I think many of us were just glad to see that the meeting took place. But if you talk to the people who were present and observed the discussions, they were pretty forward-leaning. And they were talking about introducing a stronger role for security into AUKUS. So pretty interesting first day for Marco Rubio. Didn't look like sort of the maggish retrenchment that some people have talked about. So, we will see. I think a lot of what we're seeing now, it's this sort of rush of executive orders and the counter challenges to that. So the administration seems focused on immigration. It seems focused on workforce issues. Seems focused on a lot of things. Not really a lot of clarity on Indo-Pacific policy yet, other than sort of very, very top-line general direction related to deterrence to China. If I could just say a word on Taiwan, I think there are a lot of questions about how the administration will support Taiwan. Again, 1.0, I think one thing we can say with confidence is it'll be a very permissive environment for security assistance. Trump 1.0 sold more arms to Taiwan in 4 years than any previous administration since 1979, including those that were 2 terms, 8 years. So I would say a permissive environment for security assistance, cooperation on semiconductor, including supply chain integrity, but also perhaps more investment in the United States. They really championed the TSMC deal in Arizona in the first term. But questions about, what would that ultimate commitment be in terms of, are we returning to ambiguity? Are we doing something else? And what I think is kind of interesting, in a way, President Trump, in his version of it, is actually restating long-term policy, which is ambiguity. It was actually Biden that was the aberration who said not once, not twice, not 3, but 4 times that we would defend Taiwan no matter what. Trump, in his own version of it, is reintroducing ambiguity. And, I think that's a starting point. We'll see what happens in terms of further PLA coercion activities, et cetera. But I think what we can expect to see is security assistance, some expectation that Taiwan will do more for itself, which is going to be universal. But Taiwan had done okay. They're about 2.4% of GDP on defense spending, and that's up. They're running into problems now in the LY with the opposition party creating problems on this defense budget, and couldn't come at a worse time. But I think Taiwan understands there's going to be more expected in terms of resilience, in terms of their own investment in their future force, and that conversation is already well underway. So, I think it'll be slightly on the margins, a different kind of approach, but in many ways still very strongly supporting Taiwan's deterrence.
Thank you very much. You ended on the issue of Taiwan's deterrence. I'd like to turn to Ki Sensei about how you see the continuity and change, not just Taiwan, but possibly U.S.-China policy, as Mr. Shriver already alluded to. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. I don't know which language I should choose. Well, to raise questions, I decided on Japanese because, as President Sasai mentioned right now, well, later we're going to have questions and answers. When the questions are addressed in Chinese or in English or in Japanese, I'll address in those languages, but not others. So about China, I think everyone wants to hear about China. So first of all, I'd like to give you a macroscopic view. When I look at the global situation right now, regrettably, there are 3 troublemakers we're facing. Those 3 troublemakers have something in common. So they bring confusion in their own country. Xi Jinping and President Trump and President Putin. Those are 3 people. And those 3 in each country is causing turmoil and confusion. And right now we are talking about global situation. And to what extent we can reach a conclusion during this discussion is something I'm wondering right now so far. So China, about diplomatic policy. But before that, I'd like to talk about Xi Jinping, a situation, some turmoil domestically, and also outside situation. The economic situation is very much deteriorating, and for a while, we don't see any recovery, honestly speaking. I don't have time to go into details about Chinese economic situation, but according to, January the 17th statistics by the authority, 5% of the economic growth was revealed and reported. The economists I know, and I had conferences, and they always say that the biggest contribution to the economy is the National Statistics Authority. That's what they say, the economists in China are saying that, they have to be responsible for their own statements because that's not what I came up. So when you look at investment and consumption, apparently they were not really growing by 5%. The only thing that supported the economic growth was trade. and trade, especially toward the end of last year when Mr. Trump was elected, last-minute export really increased, and accordingly, PMI in January declined drastically because of that. So if you are in on some economics, you would know. So 2025 Chinese economy, aside from the public statistics numbers, I think they are going to decline more economically. So what happens is the deterioration of security situation, and mass media in Japan had problems because they report some incidents in China where Japanese nationals are involved. However, in China, there are a lot of retaliations toward the government in the society that's not reported here in Japan. So deterioration of security situation and unstable situation in China. Instability is something of a turning point for Xi Jinping's regime. And as for their foreign affairs diplomacy, I think they are keeping all the countries at bay. For example, the U.S., they are trying to keep a distance, and they want to get closer to the U.S. And the distance with Russia, they don't want to move away from Russia because they are going to face some problems. I'll talk about this later. But there's a great change in China. That's the relations with Japan. From the 13th to the 15th of January, the Secretary General of the ruling party in Japan visited Beijing with his delegation of parliamentary members. And I heard that the impression was pretty good. So U.S.-China relations are unstable, but Japan-China relations become better, and it's vice versa. So at least this year, for a year, we'll have to watch the situation because it's possible that Japan-China relations is going to improve. So a question here is our global strategy in Japan. Japan-U.S. relations, we cannot change. So overall, Japan-China relations, how we should reconstruct it. And most of the sponsor companies today are investing into China. They have businesses. So how our strategy should be vis-a-vis China about our business. And also decoupling between Japan and China is impossible. So excess reliance on China should be reduced so that we can disperse the supply chain. The speed should be determined by each company. We have to decentralize the supply chain. In the end, Taiwan, as you mentioned, Japan, the U.S., China itself. When we have this Taiwan Strait contingency, no one gets benefit. However, this is a very important card in terms of diplomacy. This is the last resort. But why China cannot invade into Taiwan? They cannot do it because thinking about oil deposit, and when you use days of deposit, oil and natural gas volume, when you compare, China cannot really survive. And the second point is food. Well, they have a large sustenance percentage. However, they need food from the other countries as well. So Chinese economy would not survive if there is any Taiwan contingency. And China has a lot of factories from other countries. So one launch of missile, multilateral, multinational companies are going to withdraw from China. And Japan as well, we are facing trouble. And the U.S. For U.S., Taiwan is a very important island country. I don't think the U.S. wants to lose Taiwan. It depends on Mr. Trump, though. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Next to Dr. Cronin, I know that you have worked on transitions as a project previously too. So how would you look at both the policy side of the change and continuity from the previous administrations as well as the process part of it, and how unique is the transition this time around?
It's unprecedented. I think this is as sharp a transition as I've ever witnessed, and that includes the first Trump administration after Obama. But as Randy Shriver suggested, this is still early days, and so we don't know how enduring much of this will be. Let me try to, in brief form, offer sort of the difference between Biden and Trump, from a rules-based order and support for multilateralism to speaking the language of realpolitik and preferring unilateralism, from managed competition to confrontation for strategic advantage, from focusing on the public sector, Team America, to focusing on the private sector in Team Trump, from looking at alliances as ends in themselves and building a latticework of alliances and partnerships, to thinking about alliances as means to an end and focusing on greater burden sharing from those allies and partners. Those are just some of the stark changes and differences between the Biden and the Trump administrations. When I think about whether this will challenge global resilience, and it is definitely a challenge to global resilience, I could pull out several big elements of Trump administration policy in this second administration, including the focus on geoeconomic rivalry, peace through strength, and a new toolkit that really bumps up against the boundaries of international norms and laws. So specifically, much of what the Trump administration is trying to do, I think, is to restore America's confidence in itself, which in and of itself is a good thing as an American. But this MAGA nationalism, the Make America Great nationalism, is sort of unbounded as well. So it depends on which direction this heads as to determine whether this will be a challenge to global resilience. Secondly is the obvious focus on securing the border, both by sending troops, by resorting to deportation again, but adding as well new focus on homeland security, the Iron Dome for America. Come up with an architecture in the next 60 days is the instruction given to Secretary of Defense Hegseth. I think most Americans would probably say these are probably overdue. There was a certain neglect of the border. In fact, I think it was one of the Biden administration's chief failures was to impose law and order on our border. Most countries have this. Now the question, though, is how do you do that? And that's where we get into debate about whether this is challenging global resilience or supporting it. Deregulating for growth. And here, again, there are good and more controversial elements. Sort of the dismantlement of the administrative state, as it's sometimes put, is coming in the form of agencies that many people in this room may not know about. I mean, OPM, Office of Personnel Management, OMB, Office of Management and Budget, talking about a Schedule F that would essentially make civil servants, political appointees, subject to being let go. The indeed attempt to buy out all federal employees by email. These are unprecedented moves when seen as a whole, but the idea of a Department of Governmental Efficiency, the idea of bringing in corporate America to say, let's get back to effective business and efficiency, so you can see the good and the kind of challenging sides of this dilemma. The peace through strength, which aims at mostly a favorable balance of power, which in some ways is continuity in U.S. policy in the post-war world. So it really depends on how this is done. And obviously, Greenland, Panama, you know, those were not the obvious choices for a more favorable balance of power. We didn't necessarily expect to hear that so much in this first week. And yet there's a logic to it in terms of thinking about America now not as a status quo or declining power, but as one that is going back to its roots and trying to bring back the optimism and strength of America. Again, I see negative and positive elements here fighting for each other and who will prevail in this fight. The modern toolkit, finally, you know, wanting a modern lethal military force where the ethos of war fighting is brought back into the military is a good point, as Randy was talking about. This culture war, though, does it alienate more people than it unites? So what are we sacrificing for this cohesion that we're hoping to get out of this fighting force, as well as thinking about direct engagement with leaders, especially with potentially adversarial or competitive leaders, Xi Jinping, Putin, Kim Jong-un, but also Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Shiba. All of these are sort of expected early on summit meetings that could be occurring. Very important, very direct. This is a new leadership, a new management in charge with a certain vibrancy. That's a good thing, but how will they turn out? That's the question, and we'll get to that in other rounds of the question here. Thank you.
Thank you. Last but not the least, Ambassador Sasai, what is your view of the continuity versus change question?
Looking over the history of the relationship, say, from Obama to Trump, Trump to Biden, now again back to Trump, I think there is more element of continuity rather than the change. As Pat and Randy told, I think when it comes to the regional, for example, architecture, like free and open in the Pacific, and also the strengthening of alliance and the proper management of the relationship with China, whether you go to more hawkish position or more liberal position. But I think there is a continued process of the bilateral strategic dialogue that includes more deepening of the alliance relationship, not only defense and security, but also regional sort of undertakings, and even globally. I mean, how we are advancing our collaboration with the United States on Ukraine, for example. When there was a Russian invasion into Crimea, say, we are on the edge of G7. We are not necessarily in the forefront of all this sanctions against Russia. I think nowadays, we are more in the center of this, Western alliance. So on the whole, if you look at the history in relative terms, I think it's expanding and getting better. If I say this, that I sound too optimistic, possibly. Of course, there are some problems ahead, like especially, if Trump leadership is basically don't care about multilateral institutions like UN, WHO, and disarmament, human rights, and global warming and so forth. And that's pretty bad, to be honest. But obviously that would affect the Western effort to advance. And so I'm sure that there will be some grave impact. And also not only in the impact on the individual country's policy, but also the mood of the global, spirit that is going to be jeopardized. So I think challenge for the alliance is how we could work together, knowing that Trump is not going to be serious about all this liberal agenda. So I think the question arises, how could we do in the forum like G7, or how we could advance our collaboration with European nations, which are still trying to keep these goals alive. And that's one thing. But second thing is that, there are some concern on the part of Japan that what happened if the Trump tariff would affect us. Affect means that affecting their relationship with China, and also if that would go global, that would also be impacting upon Japanese export, car industries and so forth. So could Japan be exceptions? We're not quite sure that if all this tariff is a kind of negotiating instrument, well, then we have to negotiate. But we really don't know if this is a policy of pick and choose, say, the initial phase, he picked up, Panama, Colombia, Mexico, Canada, and Greenland, whatever. So if you go on to pick up on the issues and then try to impose a tax, then I think that would give a chilling impact. And also the U.S. economy, that's pretty bad. I mean, in terms of inflation, and going back to the history, we see a lot of past tragic example how these high tariffs have impacting on the global economy, not on the economy, but also the mode of the age. That's very much disruptive. So in terms of how we would advance our relationship, I think we need to talk candidly about the adverse impact of all this global tariff. That's the first point. The second point is that there is these issues of burden sharing, defense and security burden sharing, and Mr. Trump is warning that there should be more defense spending on the part of Europe. NATO countries not doing good enough. But again, I think that could be discussed against the background of the fact that Russia, deterrence against Russia did not work. That was not simply because I think the Ukraine was not part of NATO. I think also because of European countries' readiness to intervene if it is necessary. That still continues to be the question. What would you do if Trump is not really intervening militarily? Would the other European countries are ready to go? I don't know. But again, I think that could be the issue. Then what happened to Japan? Which part do we support? I'm not quite sure. Do we support Trump? Or do we support the European countries? Or what? And then what could happen if Mr. Trump would say that, well, Japan 2% GDP, it's great, but compared to the other countries, it's not sufficient. So are we ready to address this question seriously? But my answer is that we must be ready to answer, not necessarily because Mr. Trump is saying this or that, but because whether this is necessary for our own security, together with the United States. That's the heart of the issue. I will stop here.
Thank you. Let me get to the topic of the tariffs, because President Trump calls himself a tariff man, because I think it relates to the politics domestically in the U.S., that it is going to raise prices in the U.S., and that can hurt him if he's trying to get something done, especially in the first 2 years before the election. So what do you think about the prospects of the tariff man's biggest weapon, tariff, maybe backfiring to President Trump? Or is there, what do you see about his use of tariffs? Mr. Shriver.
Yeah, I didn't mention it in my opening. I knew we were going to get to it. And I think so far we have to recognize it's the dog that didn't bark so far. I mean, he talked so much about tariffs during the campaign and labeled himself tariff man. And we haven't quite seen the application of new tariffs yet. We've seen the threat of new tariffs. And I think that the reason is precisely the point embedded in your question, that there is serious debate about the impact that'll have on the U.S. economy. And that's a debate that's happening internally and discussed privately, but there is concern that aggressive use of tariffs could lead to inflation at a time when the president has pledged to bring down inflation and improve the U.S. economy by virtue of stabilizing prices, et cetera. I think they're coming, and I think there will be tariffs applied to China. And the reason is, if you look at who supports tariffs and for what reason, they really kind of all align on China. There's a camp that says, we need tariffs to deal with trade imbalances and support U.S. industry, close the trade deficits through use of this tool. There's a group of China hawks that say we need to use tariffs to thwart China's modernization efforts in certain key sectors and make it more costly for them overall to implement this massive military civil fusion program, and so tariffs are one tool in the toolkit for thwarting those ambitions. And then there's a small camp that sees this as revenue, which is that camp is the president. So that all sort of comes together on China. It doesn't really come together easily anywhere else, all those camps. And that overriding concern of inflation, I think, will inform how they move forward. I think it's very likely we'll see the threat of tariffs used to address policy differences. We've already seen it with respect to Colombia, and I expect it'll be wielded as a threat to Canada and Mexico and maybe Panama, maybe Denmark. I don't know. But I think the issuance of global tariffs, I think there's some caution there. I'm not saying it's not going to happen, but I think there's some caution there. I think the likely outcome is that they will hold off on something that is universal, and they will continue to apply in select cases. Now, my experience in Trump 1.0 is no one was immune to this ally, friend, partner, whatever. If there's a concern about a particular strategic industry, they will call that a threat to national security. And for me personally, those were some very uncomfortable conversations. I personally don't like describing our policy as one that sees partners like Japan and Australia as threats to our national security. So I'd prefer that those things be worked out rather than resorting to those tools. But I suspect that'll be wielded as a potential threat and maybe even applied if the president and his team see particular threats in sectors that they view as strategic sectors.
Thank you. So you mentioned the China aspect of this issue playing out. Ki Sensei, you talked about the situation in China. How does China see the Trump administration? Dr. Shriver, you mentioned that the arc, where there's more continuity, and I think Ambassador Tsai mentioned that there's more continuity than you might expect on certain policies. How does China see the Trump 2.0? Do they see it in some ways an opportunity, or do they see the downsides? How does Xi Jinping look at the possible Trump administration? Because you mentioned they are now trying to measure the distance. And what kind of distance do they see right now? Do they see an opportunity there?
Well, in the Trump 1.0, Xi administration learned about the experiences about how to play with Trump administration and 2.0. For example, since last December in Beijing, that for example, People's Daily, they just gathered the papers on the the U.S. and China friendship, about the episode, something about like that. And also, you can find that Chinese government want to improve the diplomatic policy with the United States. Why? Because Chinese economies declined so sharply, and it's necessary for China to export more and more the goods and the service to United States. And meanwhile, China want to learn the technologies from American companies and the laboratory, something like that. But how to rebuild and how to reconstruct the credibility with the United States, it is a very hard task for Xi's administration, because I found that inside Xi's administration, even nobody, I think, that they are the expert on American issue. Even Wang Yi, he can speak Japanese, but he cannot speak English. And also, Xi himself, he does not have any experience of, internationally. So I just read some papers published in China. They just want to, play with Trump administration 2.0 peacefully, and they want to reconstruct the new administration post Trump, because they only have 4 years, or especially the first 2 years, is very serious for China. And at this time, I still think that for China, it's very difficult about the domestic economy, how to sustain and stabilize the domestic economics, I think.
Thank you. I'd like to now ask both Ambassador Sasai and Dr. Cronin about the alliance. That is to say, I believe that a lot has been done in Japan for Japan to do more on its own for defense and to work and to modernize the alliance with the United States in various ways, and also work with others in terms of alliance networks. And especially one of the major accomplishments was the trilateral between Japan, ROK, and the US. How do you think what Japan has done in terms of the networking is resilient enough to not be overturned by changes in US policy? And also in terms of what Japan's been doing, Ambassador Sasai, you led the commission that led to the national security strategy of Japan and the national defense strategy. Do you think Japan would, and Japan's now implementing what has been on the agenda, do you think Japan needs to do something different or more? And I guess that goes to Dr. Cronin. Is there something about the alliance? I think there has been a lot of advances. Is there something that could be a potential vulnerability? And I'm curious to know, would it be about more demands for defense spending, or is it something about basing, or do you see any points that could be in jeopardy or something that might come up as a potential issue in the next 2 years? So, Ambassador Sasai.
Well, thank you. When it comes to defense and national security agenda, my view is that we could do more. We should. Because when we worked on this national security strategies, 3 documents, day by day, there is a change of security environment around us. So on the assumption that we continue to build up our military asset and to make our alliance stronger, including joint operational commands, and also wider collaboration with countries in the region like Philippines and even Indonesia and Australia, Quad, and India, of course. These would be going on. But when we look at what's happening in North Korea, say, they continue to build up their missiles and continue to not really test it seriously nuclear weapon, but they are ready to deploy more nuclear weapons. And when it comes to China, I think their goal is there, 50 years of big military build-up plan. And so our plan is 5 years, and beyond that, 5 years possibly. But are we sufficient? I mean, and in terms of what's happening in Ukraine, depending on how Russia will be ending up, they could continue to be a potential risk for us, even if there is some settlement on Ukraine issues. So the issue is more on the capability rather than the will. Of course, will part, we need to mobilize our awareness that, like the other countries around us, including people's mindset and how we will cope with the emerging threat. So putting all this together, I think we shouldn't be complacent of what we have decided and we are achieving now. I think important thing is we continue to follow through the goals we set up under this new national security framework. But when it comes to the relative capability we would have within 5 years, say, or beyond that, especially when it comes to outer space and cyber defense and all the issues around us, together with the possible deployment of U.S. missiles in the region and more preparedness and extended deterrence. I think there are more things to do. And the question is, again, as I said before, I think as the Prime Minister will go to the United States and have a discussion, and following the foreign minister's visits, there could be more extensive dialogue and mechanism work on these issues, and that is very important. We need to have a solid, I would say, messaging, stories about where our alliance is heading for in preparation for the future dangers. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that we have to think ourselves that, for example, our capability for cyber defense, it's new still. In spite of the fact that we will have hopefully legislation enacted soon, but we need to begin to build up the sufficient preparedness capacity. And we are totally behind, for example. Drone operational capacity. Do we have sufficient capacity to cope with the contingency and so forth? So these are big agenda, continue to be. And so, as I said, without being told by Mr. Trump, we need to think ourselves what we could do more. That's my conclusion.
Thank you very much. Dr. Curran, I'm especially thinking about the host nation support issue, where we will be heading towards renegotiation. That's one, if it was not the tariffs, that's something that President Trump previously liked to play upon. So what's your view about the state of the alliance, and what kind of, is the alliance resilient enough in a way?
Well, I think the alliance is resilient enough, and yet you can never have enough resilience. It's very important for the United States and Japan to build up those channels of communication and coordinate, because that may be one of the vulnerabilities when there are sudden decisions made in Washington that are not well versed here in Tokyo. They could create misunderstanding and challenges, and that could be including on the host nation support issues, or it could be tariffs, it could be other issues that affect Japan's economy and well-being. I don't think it's going to be just host nation support on its own, though. I think, for President Trump, he puts everything on the table in terms of contributions. And there, it's very hard not to be impressed with what Japan brings to the table, whether it's foreign direct investment, or whether it's the increased defense spending, whether it's the leadership internationally. For instance, indeed, if there is a ceasefire on Ukraine, I see Japan as being an early mover on that kind of issue to try to help the peace-building process. Similarly, if there's negotiations with Xi Jinping and with Putin, and if they can talk about a New START agreement, I could see Japan being at the forefront of wanting the NPT and nuclear nonproliferation issues to be maintained and supported. So I see a lot of opportunities for Japan to be both the trusted ally and the effective internationalist country that it is, the economic power that's making sort of niche strategic investments, whether it's in defense industry, that'll be counted essentially. You don't need to be just talking about host nation support. If you're finding new ways to work jointly in vitally needed defense industries, that'll be taken more than into consideration. So I'm optimistic that Japan is going to be able to continue to find these roles, notwithstanding the debacle over U.S. Steel, by the way. And living in Pittsburgh and Washington, D.C., I felt this personally, because I certainly would have welcomed the infusion of technology and investment. That's not done, but you were dealing with an iconic American brand, so it was a particular unique issue. It'll be easier on some of these other issues, I imagine, when it comes to the maritime domain, space, LNG, and so on.
Thank you. So in many ways, if we put the current alliance and put on a table, not just one item, but a variety of items, we might be able to present a palette of worthy ally. Because if President Trump is very transactional and he cares about the worthiness, we don't want to be very passive about it, but maybe what you're suggesting, there's a lot that Japan can bring on the table that good communications will help in terms of putting that together. So I guess we need to now shift to the second part of the topic of discussion today, is a new U.S. administration and international order. And I sent all the panelists a question beforehand. How would you characterize or describe the current state of international order? And I guess related to that is where the U.S. is going is related to that. So if I can turn back to the initial order. Can you start, Mr. Shriver, about your view about the current state of international order in one word and going forward?
Yeah, I think the current state is it's pretty stressed. We have polycrises still unfolding, although they're in some cases reaching a stage that looks as though they may be nearing an end state of sort. But I think you say that President Trump is transactional. To a certain extent, all presidents are transactional. And in fairness, most presidents are America first, right? But all presidents are somewhat transactional, and all take into account what they think American interests are. Where I think the president is a little different is he is not particularly enamored with descriptions of enduring global frameworks, regional security frameworks, et cetera. He looks at virtually every interaction as a one-off, doesn't really think of iterated interactions in the way most people do. And I think as he comes into office and looks at these various problems, it's sort of like, I'll use a U.S. phrase, like a high school wrestler. You take them down one at a time. And he's trying to deal with Gaza, and in fact, maybe even before he took office, through his envoy, had a bit of a hand in moving those negotiations forward. In his own way, he's dealing with Ukraine. It wasn't solved on day one, as promised, but in a way, he's certainly changed the conversation with respect to what people expected his relationship with Putin to bring about. Thus far, still a lot to be determined there. And on the question of China and where things are going, I think, again, the opening bid is a hawkish approach to China, support for alliances, even the multilateral, as was evidenced through the Quad. I think I said AUKUS earlier. It's the Quad that met on the first day, and there is support for AUKUS, by the way. So I think where the president puts time and energy and thought is not these sort of grand visions of architecture. It's sort of transactional problem solving, and in some instances, in most instances, that will involve alliance, cooperation, and partnership. I'll say one last thing about his approach, which I find kind of interesting. I didn't make up this framework I'm about to describe, but it resonates with me, that in many relationships, there's a good cop, bad cop phenomena, but Trump tends to invert it. He's the good cop with Kim Jong-un, Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, our traditional adversaries, and the executive branch agencies and cabinet secretaries and others play bad cop. And, every time he said something good about Putin in the first administration, people would run out and show the record of sanctions and ways we were standing up to Russia. And in many ways, in our closest relationships, he's the bad cop on top, and the bureaucracies are the stability and the glue holding alliances and partnerships together. So he's got no issue criticizing leaders of Canada and Colombia, who's, by the way, the most pro-American country in South America. But really, in many ways, the institutions and the bureaucracies are then challenged to really be the stability and the infrastructure for keeping things not only on track but moving forward. And I think if you think about that, I think that might appeal to you too as being somewhat of an accurate description of how he approaches things.
Thank you. So how about China's view of where things are, where they would want the international order to be, and what they're trying to make that happen? What is their vision going forward, and what is their goal going forward?
Well, first of all, I think everybody just think that it's necessary to reform, for example, the United Nations. But we need a strong leadership. Who is coming to the next leader? This is the problem. And Xi's administration, they are just strengthening the relationship with Global South. And I think One Belt One Road program is just working at least partially. And we can find that Xi himself went to Peru, Brazil, and also China strengthened the relationship with ASEAN countries. This is very important for China to balance with the United States. And another point, I think that the key country here for China is Japan, because Ishiba's administration is a little easy for Xi's administration to work with, because Ishiba-san himself is not a politician of anti-China. At least Xi's administration, Xi Jinping himself, he just recognized Ishiba-san. So Beijing is just approaching Ishiba-san's administration to, for example, attract more Japanese companies to do FDI in China, and also strengthen the politicians' exchange from now on. And so for Xi's administration, that of course it's very difficult to deal with Trump, but to balance the Trump administration, Japan is a very important country, because for Japan, especially Japanese companies, China is a very big market, very attractive market. So I don't think that Japan can decouple from China. So in the coming years, I think that China would do more effort to approach to Japan, I think.
Thank you. Dr. Kernan, you recently wrote a piece titled Donald Trump 2.0 and the Next Era of Superpower Competition. So what does the new era of superpower competition look like, and how does that relate to what the international order is going to be going forward?
Well, it means that in the United States, under President Trump, there's a priority placed on preparing for confronting China, for competing with China, for engaging China, all of the above. And that is really where the main game is. And so that's why it's so instructive to see tariffs threatened at Colombia or actions toward Denmark over Greenland, because underneath the surface, it's really all about China. And that's the important thing. So when the president talks about a new golden age, some see a return to the Gilded Age, a second Gilded Age, if you will, the sort of most dynamic time of America's economic expansion and growth. Others worry about a return to what we might jokingly refer to as the gold standard. He who brings the gold makes the standards. And so it's wealth creation, and that's why you see the billionaires surrounding the Trump administration having so much influence on policy. But this could be, in some ways, a dialectical struggle here between what Philip Bobbitt once called the market state. That is, the nation state has been overcome by more corporate interests, and that's really embodied right now in sort of the tech, sort of technology CEOs and others who are dominating policy, versus Xi Jinping doubling down on the party state. Read Kevin Rudd's on Xi Jinping talking about Marxist-Leninist nationalism and how far that's come under Xi Jinping in the past decade. A very impressive study. And I think that's the clash. It's economic, it's military, it's ideological. President Trump wants to avoid World War III, but he's not afraid of taking risk. He wants to find some new trade bargains with China, not completely decouple, but he's willing to threaten significant tariffs, just not right off the bat. And even then, it may be gradual when they finally start to phase in, say in April, once he's finished his economic team review, and they've had this debate between what has been called in Washington the deal makers versus the decouplers inside the Trump administration. I think that fight still is to be found and won or lost, and then President Trump will make those final decisions. He'll take that to discussions with Xi Jinping, and depending on the Chinese reaction, that's where the world will be in 6 months.
In 6 months. So, Ambassador Sasai, what is your view? I couldn't help notice that last year's topic of this conference was a world in turmoil, and you're suggesting that we have to do a quest for resilience, and I am imagining that you do think that there needs to be a collaborative quest. So where do you see the international order, so to speak, right now, and what could be the collaborative quest going forward?
International order questions, I think people here already discussed. I think the irony is that, you know, the current Trump administration is basically seeking the peace with strength and power. That's not necessarily new, but I think the relative weight of what the great power like the United States should be, it should be balancing between the country of ideals, pursuing all these values and normative principles, and very liberal sort of goals of the sort, together with the strength, power of the thought, very traditional way. And I think ideal thing is the United States has both. But depending on the administration and depending on the change of the mood of the nation, it changes from one extreme to the others. And so from Japanese point of view, when the United States is not pursuing too much ideals and neglecting the reality, we have to say, hey, there is a reality. That happened during Obama administration, I would say, initial phase, and not really, taking seriously the long-term implications of the military buildup and also the regional, expansions of the sort. But nowadays, we have to be worried about the other extreme, possibly. I mean, all this tariff and trade war and the possible miscalculations and on the sea and so forth. And so I'm always saying that the best strategic balance for us, for Japan, is that U.S.-Japan relationship is excellent. Japan-China relationship is good. And U.S.-China relationship is so much so good. I mean, not bad. But, so at this moment, as the consensus said that China is preparing for the United States, Trump administration, and they are carefully judging and watching how far the Trump administration coming to employ the very sort of forceful negative, instrument, including tariff and so forth. But still, I believe that they like to go along with the United States in avoiding the war, as you said it, because I'm not quite sure that the Xi presidency is confident that China could win the war with the United States. I don't think they are prepared for that yet. So I think their basic strategy continue to buy the time to increase their capacity to catch up the United States in terms of strategic capability and so forth, and while embodying more of the investment, keeping the relationship, economic relationship with major countries around the world, including Japan, even the United States and Europe. And so my theory is that it's a time for us to endure and keep the strategic balance between the United States and China. Japan can do to sustain that relatively favorable strategic balance for the United States so that China would not make miscalculation to get into the war.
Thank you very much. Before we open the floor for questions, I'd like to ask three panelists, not from Japan, about what you would see to be the most important advice, if there is, to Prime Minister Shiba, who I believe is scheduled to or expected to meet with President Trump relatively soon. So what would be your one-word advice or one-sentence advice to Mr. Ishiba about preparing to meet with President Trump? How about you, from your experience in Trump 1.0, you mentioned the importance of, I guess Dr. Cronin mentioned the importance of communications, and I think you agree. It's really hard to know where the Trump administration is going to be in the next month or two. But what would you be the best way to prepare for a meeting?
I think Patrick addressed it. I think what President Trump likes to hear is, what are you doing for yourself? And what can you do for us or with us? I think historically a lot of countries come to the United States, no matter who's president, and ask, what can you give me or what can you do for me? I think President Trump likes to hear, what are you doing for yourself and what can you do to help the United States, in addition to whatever ask you might have.
How about you, Ki-sensei?
No, I don't have any
Okay. So, Dr. Cronin, what advice would you give? I understand Prime Minister Ishiba's expected to come later today. What would you be your advice to him?
My advice would be to show that he is a loyal ally, that Japan is strong in making strong decisions at home, despite being a minority government, and it's making strong decisions in support of U.S. interests abroad as well. In some of the investments, in some of the defense cooperation, some of the work on energy, can be specific things that he can attract President Trump's attention with that will be new and I think reinforce the very strong foundations of the alliance.
So reinforce the foundations, but maybe come up with some shiny, bright, good object to get his attention. So thank you. So at this point, I'd like to open the floor and the online audience to questions. Please raise your hand and wait for the mic and introduce yourself when you ask your question. Yes.
Thank you so much for excellent dialogue. My name is Atsushi Okudera with Asahi Shimbun. I'd like to ask about the President Trump's approach to China. As we all know, the President Trump didn't mention much about China, particularly tariff, on first day one, and over the last week. I'd like to, particularly in Mr. Shriver and Dr. Cronin, could you share the assessment why President Trump is now refraining from talking on China, on tariff on China, for a while? As we all know, the President Trump, it is said that he wants to visit China and have a dialogue with President Xi Jinping in the first 100 days. Probably he wants to have a kind of talk or deal such as Ukraine war or some kind of things, and President Trump believes, he needs to help end the power of China. Maybe that's could be a reason, but I'd like to know the reason why, and if they have a dialogue with President Xi Jinping, or not only bilateral, but a trilateral could be happen. President Xi Jinping and Trump and Putin, I don't know. But if this kind of dialogue happen, what kind of deal is going to happen? And one more thing, as we know, the U.S. and China had a deal on trade in 2020 in January 15th, which means that China has a lot of shopping risk about China, U.S. products. And do you believe in U.S. and China is going to have another deal, such as the first deal, or this coming years? Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for those questions. I think, as I've tried to say, I believe the Trump administration is trying to do a couple of things right now. One of them is it's having private conversations with Xi Jinping in China. So having joined that leader-to-leader discussion and having received some face and some deference from China, sending the vice president to the inauguration, I think President Trump wants to be very careful about whatever moves he makes toward China, that he has the leverage behind it, that he knows what he can get, and also that he knows what China's playbook is, because China came out pretty strong saying, oh, we've already got our playbook for countering your tariffs. You know, we can sanction critical minerals. We can use lawfare to stop and regulate businesses. And I think President Trump's economic team is gathering and debating these issues. How do we play the playbook that China's bringing? How do we get what we want? What's the best deal we can, whether it's going back to the trade deal and now trying to double that and actually implement it? And I think that debate will now happen internally over the next couple of months. And it will happen as well in a face-to-face meeting, I believe, in the next month even, between Xi Jinping and President Trump. And I think that will determine sort of the next moves, the next steps. President Trump is not locked in any position. He is maximally trying to improve American opportunities here. And we recognize the big market of China, but we also recognize the big threat that China poses. So working from TikTok, you know, to AI dominance, to energy dominance, to what's happening with nuclear weapons, all of these issues are different facets of this complex relationship that defy an easy answer or one solution. I do think, though, if President Trump, going back to the question of trilateralism and even a deal with Russia, I think President Trump would savor the opportunity to have that kind of big three meeting, because the big powers is sort of how he conveys the fact that America is still a major power, a superpower, a leading power. And he's happy to talk about trying to restrain nuclear weapons going forward, because he probably has a very powerful nuclear modernization plan that he could roll out if he's not satisfied with what he hears from Russia and China's finally taking a responsibility to join at the table and not just building these secret, opaque silos in the western desert of China, rapidly increasing their nuclear force without clarity of what their policy will be, but casting huge doubt about whether that's a no first use policy and whether that has any meaning. Those are serious issues for our third nuclear age that we're in, as Ankit Panda has in his new book by that title. So I think President Trump wants an opportunity for leadership and engagement, but he's prepared for confrontation and much tighter competition. So it really depends on the relations of these major powers. Japan, though, in all of this has a huge role to play, not just as America's most trusted ally, but also as a country that can deal directly with China and Russia as well, and can be a very important influence in a positive way on the direction that is not yet foretold. It is not yet foreordained. We don't know the outcome. We cannot answer your good questions because they have to be debated. They have to be engaged in a dynamic dialogue.
Thank you. Do you have anything to add?
Just very briefly, I think competition with China will remain the organizing principle for our executive branch. They'll continue to get help from Congress, by the way. The Congress, through the ongoing work of the Select Committee on China and other committees with purview, will be very active in this year legislating aspects of the competition with China. But I do, Patrick is absolutely right. He wants latitude for his own face-to-face discussions with Xi Jinping. He's a person that often operates on impulse, and sometimes those impulses are actually in contradiction with one another. So he likes the big splashy event, and he likes, you know, breaking through precedent and doing things that, you know, were the unthinkable. But he doesn't take a bad deal. I was with him in both Hanoi and Singapore. He walked out of Hanoi because he didn't get a good deal, or at least what he thought was a good deal. And he is going to absolutely explore if there's another trade deal with China and something that could be to the benefit of the United States. But I don't think he'll take a bad deal, and I don't think he at any fundamental level he believes that there's a possible G2-ish kind of approach to the world, despite the readout he gave of his conversation with Xi Jinping, which sounded very G2-ish. If you understand a little bit about the questions he's asking, his team, how he's thinking through things, he believes that China is a threat. He believes that Xi Jinping is struggling with his economy, and that there are opportunities for the United States to really gain leverage and position ourselves well before there's that conversation with Xi Jinping that gets to any real substance. Remember, before meeting Kim Jong-un, there was fire and fury first. So he's in a period where he's going to want to gain leverage, seek leverage, and he believes that there are opportunities for that before there's any consideration of a splashy new deal with China, I believe.
Thank you.
Okay. My name is Oscar Omio. I'm chief priest of the Yasukuni Jinja Shinto Shrine. A question is, should the alliance between the United States and Japan change? And if so, how? Given the emergence of the growth influence of the global South. The motivation of this question is that I spent 40 years in the Navy, and I was every effort to making this alliance stronger. And because that, and beyond this alliance with coalition countries, because we share the common value. But after that, I spent 3 years in East Africa as an ambassador of Japan to the Republic of Djibouti, and I saw a completely different scenery where no one shares this value. And given the emergence of the global South, how should we cope with those, given our experience of the 70 years of the alliance? Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think what we could do together with the United States on the global South issue is a critical part of how we could manage the global order. And there is, of course, a concern that the United States focus is more on the geopolitics and not necessarily placing too much emphasis on the development issues, including Africa and some Asian countries and so forth. And while I don't say we are neglecting, but we are possibly trying to do better. But for example, if the Trump administration is reviewing its development assistance program, suspending and redo it again, how it will be looking like, we don't know at this moment. But I think what Japan can do is to continue to encourage the United States to reach over the global South. Not to mention the countries like China and Brazil and South Africa and the major one, but weaker one too. So I think for that reason, I think there could be more room for the strategic collaboration, the specific country-specific strategy to work on. That was done by the Biden administration, even first Trump administration. So I think we continue to build up our own effort to place our resources to support all this global South, so that they will not be really echoing the rhetoric initiated by China for the global peace and security and so forth. Of course, we can't really neglect the Chinese economic influence to the region, but I think we need to keep up on our effort, at least to keep these countries neutral in terms of a strategic position they are taking, so that they will not be overwhelmed by Chinese economic influence in the region.
Thank you. Anything to add? No. Let me pick up one question from the online audience. The question is from Mr. Furuya Kentaro, and it was in Japanese, but allow me to translate. How do you think the commitment in the Indo-Pacific region would change under Trump 2.0? The U.S.-Japan alliance is the cornerstone of regional security, but U.S. presence is absolutely necessary. Under Trump 1.0, there was more freedom of navigation operations, FONOPs, in the South China Sea. How do you think the U.S. presence will change under Trump 2.0?
Well, one of the things he's emphasized in some of his conversations with Indo-Pacific leaders is the need for cooperation on shipbuilding, particularly with South Korea, but I think potentially Japan, potentially Australia. There's a recognition that in this region, as a distant power, in dealing with the tyranny of time and distance, that quantity has a quality all its own, and we are woefully behind when it comes to being able to have the kind of presence and posture that would give the Chinese pause in areas like the South China Sea. And so that's an interesting area of potential cooperation with allies, I think. And it's a recognition that even though his first term, is only 4 years in the rearview mirror, 5 years in the rearview mirror, things have changed considerably with China's massive investments in its surface fleet. I think the other thing to sort of keep an eye on is, how the United States will incorporate lessons from Ukraine and this changing nature of warfare, and how we're going to deal with this ever-present tyranny of time and distance. And will our military services embrace autonomous, semi-autonomous surface vessels, subsurface drones? I mean, it's really the only way we can truly make up this capacity gap that we face with China. And I mentioned the defense budget before and didn't really return to it. The fact of the matter is, in the first term, we were able to say peace through strength because we're going to spend a lot more on defense. That's going to be very difficult, just given the mood of the Republican caucus and the need for fiscal constraint and discipline. And, Trump has been in Doral Country Club talking about all these priorities that are going to amount to 10 trillion something, and no plan for offsets on that. But if you're going to find money, it's the Willie Sutton principle. You go where the money is, which is the Defense Department. You're not going to touch Medicare, Medicaid. You're not going to touch Social Security. You can't touch interest on the national defense, national debt. It's the Defense Department. So there's a possible move where we completely reorient how we think about posture and presence in the Pacific and rely a lot more on cheaper, attritable kinds of autonomous and semi-autonomous capabilities.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. Stephen Nagy from the International Christian University and a visiting fellow at the Japan Institute for International Affairs. Great panel. My question really revolves around the connectivity of war and how we really can't separate theaters anymore. The conflict in Ukraine has put enormous pressure on resources and munitions. I think it's shed light on the fact that if there's another contingency within this region, across the Taiwan Straits or on the Korean Peninsula or in the South China Sea, that we're really not prepared to deal with that. So my question is perhaps for Ambassador Sasai and Dr. Cronin and Randy Shriver. How is the Trump administration thinking about this? And what are the areas of cooperation that the Trump administration and Japan and South Korea and other allies of the United States can work in to deal with this real serious challenge? Thank you.
Well, Professor Nagy, thank you very much. I think this really just builds on what Randy Shriver was talking about, and that reinforces the fact that there is a deep recognition inside people going into the Trump administration, inside the Defense Department in particular, that our defense industrial base is woefully inadequate for this kind of global multi-front contingency, which is something that can no longer be dismissed. And so the more that we can invest in our own manufacturing capacity at home, the more that we can do that jointly with trusted allies like Japan and South Korea and Australia, the more that we can find new ways to pre-position and build up the kind of inventory of precision-guided munitions, drones, and other uncrewed systems probably, will probably be a high priority for what comes out of the defense review once it's finished. And so, first of all, the Defense Department has to be repopulated with officials. Bridge Colby's not been, scheduled for confirmation hearing that I know of. And then you have to make a coherent strategy, and then you have to start to implement it. So I hope that in the next couple of months, next few months, certainly the latter half of this year, there should be a pretty robust, vigorous program for not just the shipbuilding cooperation, which is urgently needed and very important. And by the way, one of the positive things that I think will happen, even if we go toward a Democratic Party of Korea-led government, which is likely in the spring, late spring, early summer, after a snap election, which is my projection of what will happen in South Korea, I think the shipbuilding still is saved in this relationship because it's just too important for both countries, for the industries, and there's potential win-win cooperations there. So I'm optimistic that this urgent problem will continue to receive the attention that it deserves, because there's widespread bipartisan agreement, I think, as well in Capitol Hill for finding solutions. And there aren't enough good partners like Japan to sort of turn to make some of these things happen.
Yeah, I agree on the point that we could do more, especially in the field of industrial collaborations. Like you said, shipping industries, high-tech, AI, and this could include a country like ROK, as you said. And this was already discussed in the previous administration, so this needs to be developed further. But when we discuss about it, there has to be some fundamental basis of the trust. If the United States will think that Japan's still buying the U.S. company, this is the issue of national security. This would not really fly well. So I think that's what we need to discuss and resolve before getting into more serious industrial dialogue. I want to say it.
I would just mention, since the ambassador mentioned AI, I mean, the whole Stargate sort of initiative is very intriguing, not least because now we have the DeepSeek sort of challenge from China. That's going to be reviewed. But it points to one of the highest priorities of this fourth industrial revolution and this competition. And Japan is well poised to be partnered with the United States and some other leading democracies to try to find the best competitive way forward on this technology that speaks to the connectivity globally that we're going to need to maintain even in a crisis.
I guess I will add. I think one thing that the Biden administration did extremely well was work on posture initiatives in the Indo-Pacific. And, our fundamental problem, in addition to being distant power, the tyranny of time and distance, is where we are forward deployed, we're highly concentrated, which in an A2AD environment is just unacceptable and not sustainable. So they did a terrific job with the Philippines, expansion of dispersal opportunities in the Pacific Islands, work with other potential partners for access, overflight, et cetera. But filling in the pieces of that posture initiative is going to be really important. So you got to pour the concrete. You've got to make these airstrips. You've got to have a coherent plan for dispersal and distribution and fighting in that kind of environment. And that is very, very much relying on alliances and partnerships. The other thing is, even if that's accomplished, the changing capabilities, the improving capabilities of the PLA right now, they have done extremely well in developing their architecture for a kill chain. They can essentially have persistent surveillance on us throughout just about all the Western Pacific. So even a dispersed force is still vulnerable. So cooperation in space, in electronic warfare, the counter C4ISR is really critical and I would say underappreciated and understudied. And that's where, again, partners will be very key.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I believe our time is up. So please join me in a round of applause to the wonderful panelists for the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kotani, for your moderation. Another round of warm applause is in order for everyone on the stage.